Hello, everyone, and welcome to the BYU Library Family History webinar series. We're glad you could join us today. I'm Megan Smith, and I'll be your host for this webinar. If you have technical difficulties during the webinar, please use the chat box and I can address your concerns. You are welcome to use the chat box during the webinar for comments, insights, and questions. However, all questions will be addressed at the end of the presentation. Our next webinar is on March 18th with Catherine Grant. She will be giving a presentation called Learning to Love Family History Research. If you would like to access a previous webinar, please visit our webinar index on our website or search on our YouTube channel. All of our webinars are recorded and uploaded by the following Monday for your convenience. We also post links to recordings and other updates on our Facebook account. For today's webinar, we are pleased to hear from Maureen Brady, who will be talking about Tennessee family history research. Before we begin, here's a little bit about our speaker. Maureen Brady, a former school librarian and computer educator, has over 40 years' experience with family history research. She has traced her Scottish roots back to the end of the 17th century and beyond, and has also pursued Chicago and the Midwest, the Trans-Allegheny U.S., Quebecois, Irish, and Swedish research. Maureen has made numerous presentations to genealogical societies, libraries, conferences, and workshops throughout the U.S., as well as presenting for the Brigham Young University Library Family History webinar series. She is a member of the Genealogical Speakers Guild and a life member of the Aberdeen and Northeast Scotland Family History Society and the Ohio, Chicago, and McHenry County, Illinois Genealogical Societies. Maureen is also active in the Kentucky, Middle Tennessee, and Lake County, Illinois Genealogical Societies, the British Interest Group of Wisconsin and Illinois, and the Chicago Scots Scottish Genealogical Society. Maureen, if you're ready, we'll turn the time over to you.
Thank you, Megan. Don't forget the handout.
Yes, I will send the handout in the chat. Thanks.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for coming this evening and taking a look at how you research Tennessee, one of our very first states after the Revolution. We're going to do a little bit of historical and geographical background first before we look into where we can find the records. So first of all, this is a map that I found, which is from 1825, but it shows you very clearly, I think, the lay of the land of eastern Tennessee particularly. You can see the mountain ranges of the Alleghenies, the Appalachians coming down out of Virginia, Virginia being in the upper right, North Carolina being in the lower right, and then Tennessee and Kentucky. And you can see how that would have been a very easy route to get into the interior if they had followed those rivers. And the one river in particular in the middle of the screen, which becomes the Tennessee, was one of the routes into Tennessee later on in history. So we've got these ridges of the Alleghenies that were with a kind of a river path between the two main ridge sets. And that became the avenue of settlement and movement down into what is today Tennessee. This is a map from 1771 that I found in the Library of Congress. And before the Revolution, the colonies of Virginia, North and South Carolina had claimed the land all the way to the Mississippi. So these were the boundaries in 1771. And if you can kind of take your eye and kind of see how that can superimpose, there's Illinois in the upper left pink. That was part of the Illinois of Virginia at that point. But that red line right through the middle is roughly the boundary of today's Kentucky and Tennessee. So you can see that Tennessee would have been claimed by North Carolina, where Kentucky was claimed by Virginia. So let's first look at the biggest group that settled in Tennessee early, and that would be the Ulster Scots, or sometimes called the Scots-Irish. And they were in the back country. So this came from a book called Albion Seed. It is in the bibliography that I included with the handout. And it's a quote that to the Appalachian Highlands migrated the Scots-Irish border people. They were poor and came from a survival-oriented culture. They brought with them an idea of natural freedom that was not necessarily consonant with law and order. So all of that kind of translates to say they were ideal for the frontier because they were survival oriented, and pretty much they did what they wanted to do and didn't worry terribly much about organized law or government. So we take a look at this map of the British Isles, and they originally would have come from this portion of the British Isles, the border between Scotland and England, more on the Scottish side than the English side. And then in the 17th century, most of that group were then moved to Northern Ireland, the province of Ulster, the eastern half of it primarily, stayed there for about 100 years, and then moved on to the United States, to the colony of Pennsylvania, where William Penn was welcoming anyone and everyone to inhabit this new colony. So they started from the borders of Scotland, moved over to Ulster for about 100 years, and then came to the United States to Pennsylvania. And then this is the settlement. All the dark gray areas is primarily where they settled, but you can see in Western Maryland, Western Pennsylvania, Western Virginia, down into North Carolina, there is a strong concentration of these Scots. They are following the Shenandoah and New River valleys of the Western Virginia colony. Let's take a look at how then they move south. So the Cumberland Gap was the only gap or opening in the continuous Cumberland Mountain ridgeline. And there was what Joseph Martin tried in 1769 to build a fort and make a settlement, but it didn't survive, wasn't very successful. But then in 1775, Daniel Boone went through that same gap and widened the path into the interior so that it was a little easier for people to come and start settling Kentucky and Tennessee. Now, you note this is 1775, before the Revolution actually began. So that by the 1790s, that trail had been widened enough to actually accommodate wagon traffic and became known as the Wilderness Road. So here we have a map. This is that same map showing those ridge lines. And right there is where the Cumberland Gap is, right at the junction of Tennessee, Kentucky, Virginia, and part of North Carolina. It perhaps is why those four states kind of meet at that point, but certainly it is a meeting point and it is an opening into the interior all the way to the Mississippi through that gap. So here's a map. This one comes from the National Park Service, but the purple part up in the upper right and middle, that's the path from Philadelphia where the main ships would have come in, then through to the western portion of Pennsylvania, past that first ridge line, down the Great Valley Road, the Shenandoah and New River valleys, and then down through the Wilderness Road, and then across to the Cumberland Gap, and then on into Kentucky. This was the original route for Boone's settlers, particularly as they settled Kentucky. Now remember, they came out of Virginia. So Virginia claimed what is today Kentucky, so it made logical sense for them to go on to Kentucky. But there was also an area just to the south of that that was also fertile land and was partially settled in the same period. And they created something called the Watauga Valley in 1769. This was a combination of people from North Carolina and Virginia, just outside of where the Cumberland Gap is. They were settling on the east, if you will, the eastern side of that ridge. But this would have been the first settlements in that part of the country that today would be called Tennessee. Then in 1776, at the very beginning of the Revolution, the territory of Tennessee was designated by North Carolina as the Washington District. So it was still claimed by North Carolina, but they gave it a district name called Washington District, probably to differentiate between those living on the other side of the Allegheny Ridges. A year later, Washington County, North Carolina, was established to provide actual government. So for 1 year, it was a district, so everything would have been out of the North Carolina capital. But in 1777, we now have Washington County, North Carolina, which primarily is still looking at that far northeast corner of the state. But there is now an actual government there as early as 1777, so you might start to find actual court records and perhaps even deed records. I think it is still a little too early, though, for marriage records. So in 1784, North Carolina finally ceded their claim to Tennessee back to the U.S. government, and the Watauga area settlers organized the state of Franklin. The Franklin was Benjamin Franklin, and they thought they could establish their own state, but they really didn't have enough resources to do that. It was very short-lived, but for a short period of time, there was the state of Franklin, which is today Northeast Tennessee, and you can see on this map, we have Sullivan County and Greene County and Sevier County and so forth. You get the idea of where it is in that far northeast corner of Tennessee. Again, the records are sparse, but there would be court records and there would be possible deed records. Certainly in this time period, you might begin to see bounty land grants from the Revolutionary War Service. If we take a look at Middle Tennessee, so Tennessee was settled first in the far east, and then secondly in the middle. And so today even it is still considered Eastern Tennessee, Middle Tennessee, and Western Tennessee. Even their genealogical societies are organized in that way. Well, if you take a look at this map, and then you can see the border, the yellow being the area that we're looking at, and up in the corner you have the boundary of Tennessee with Virginia, North Carolina, and you see the Blue River, that's the Tennessee River, and it actually goes further up closer into Virginia than what's showing on this map. But it is a major river route from that area of northeastern Tennessee, southwestern Virginia. And you could take it down, dipping down into Alabama, and then coming back up through Tennessee up to the Ohio River. This was the Tennessee River Valley, and it was the way that families could easily then get to Middle Tennessee, which is where North Carolina was granting a lot of their land grants. We'll talk about that in a minute. Once you're at the Ohio, then it becomes very easy. There's another look at it. So showing the landforms, but going up to the Ohio, and then a few miles upriver, you get to the Cumberland River, another major river in the area, and then you can come down the Cumberland to what is today Nashville, Tennessee. So Fort Nashville then was established in 1779 in the French Lick area of the Cumberland River Valley. So by 1779, we have Watauga, eventually Franklin in eastern Tennessee, and then the Fort Nashboro settlements in the middle of the Cumberland River Valley. 1784, when North Carolina ceded her Western territory back to the United States, however, they set aside a military reserve, which they were going to use to give land to their North Carolina Revolutionary War veterans. Now, in the Revolutionary War, a man could serve in a colonial/state regiment, i.e. Pennsylvania line or West Virginia line, or he could serve in the Continental Army, or over time could actually end up in both. Well, for those that served in the state lines, Virginia, Maryland, North Carolina, etc., most of the time after the Revolution, the states didn't have the money to pay them. So most of the states then granted them land in their former colonial grabs, if you will. I hate to use that word, but in that area west of the Appalachians that they had then claimed to the Mississippi, they withheld some of that land to grant these land grants to their veterans. And many of those veterans then moved on to Middle Tennessee or Kentucky, but coming out of North Carolina, excuse me, they would have gone to Middle Tennessee, or they would have sold their land grant, and then that person would have gone on to Middle Tennessee. So here's where the North Carolina boundary lands are. And you can see that that's basically the middle of the state. There's the Cumberland River right along the northern part of it. The Tennessee River is its western boundary. You can see the rivers all up in the upper eastern portion of Tennessee, and then the Cherokee Reservation down below. But this is 1783, and North Carolina claimed that portion along the Cumberland River for its military veterans. And that's where your first very heavy settlement starts to occur in that Middle Tennessee period, centering on Fort Nashboro, but then fanning out from there. In 1790, the federal government created the territory of the United States south of the Ohio River. We also had the territory north of the Ohio River, which we call the Northwest Territory, but we also had the Southwest Territory created in 1790. 1791, Knoxville, in that far eastern portion that was first settled, the Knoxville Gazette became the first newspaper published in Tennessee. And in 1796, Tennessee was admitted as the 16th state to the Union. In 1796, the settlement was primarily east in the Knoxville area generally, in the Nashville area generally, and along the Mississippi River, which were still leftovers from the French settlements of the French colonial period. But in between the Mississippi settlements and Middle Tennessee, there really wasn't much in the way of settlement yet. So now we're going to take a look at settlement and growth by map. So this is 1777, and these are the counties of Tennessee as they existed at that point in time. And it's telling us that Washington County was created by North Carolina, and that was originally the Washington District. I had mentioned that earlier. So Washington County was basically 3/4 or more of the state of today's state of Tennessee in 1777. By 1790, we have 4 counties in the east and 3 counties in the center, Sumner, Davidson being the 2 primarily settled ones. And you notice the boundary, which is under contention between Kentucky and Tennessee. So there's dotted lines there because at this point, that boundary line between the 2 states has not been firmly established. By 1796, we have more counties in the east. You can see how it's working down the line of the mountains, working their way southwest, and then the middle of the state is getting bigger, and we have another county there. 1809, this is after it had been a state for about 20 years. We now have almost the eastern 2/3 of the state settled with county governments, except for that Cherokee Reservation in the southeast, and virtually nothing yet to the west, except, as I said, those former French settlements along the Mississippi. By 1836, we have full settlement of today's state of Tennessee. These are the boundaries at that point in time. There are still additional boundary changes as periods of time go on and population shift and so on. But if we look at 1960, which is the last year that any county boundary was made, this is the final, as of today, boundary definitions for the state of Tennessee, including that little bump up into Kentucky, which was under contention back in the 1790s. So we have a look from east to west, filling in from the east to west. And so it's Eastern Tennessee, Middle Tennessee, and Western Tennessee. You will hear that often in discussions in books. So let's now look at the records. Starting at Family Search, it's the best place I feel to start, because it's free, but because they have a lot of material for Tennessee in their vast library, starting with the Research Wiki. I always tell people when new patrons come into the Family Search Centers or just even experienced researchers who are looking at a new geographic area, I always tell them start with the Research Wiki. This is going to help you get organized. It's also going to help you get a sense of the history of the area, what records were created, what records still exist, and so on. So to get to the Research Wiki, if you don't know about it, it's basically a family history encyclopedia, which is maintained by Family Search with all sorts of information to help you with your research. So you go to the Family Search homepage, you go up to Search, and then you come down to Research Wiki. And when you choose that, you get this search screen. And up in that one little search box, you put a geographic location. This is not for names. This is for background and resources for a specific geographic location. It could be a state, it could be a country, it could be a county. It could actually even be an occupation or religion. But in this case, we're going to put in Tennessee. And when you do that, you come to this page, the Tennessee United States genealogy page. Now, first thing you need to understand is this is only the tip of the iceberg. What comes up first on your screen is just the beginning. There will be links on here to a vast amount of information to get you started, to help you find records, to even give you some background on what records might still exist. We're not going to take a deep look at this. It's mostly to let you know it's there and encourage you to go out and start looking for yourself and playing around on this particular page in the wiki. So we get some historical background, but first I want you to look at the blue box. It's always going to be a blue box that says, in this case, Tennessee. It could easily say Canada, or it could say Africa or something like that. But because we're looking at Tennessee, Tennessee Online Genealogy Records, emphasis on the word online. When I click the blue button, I get a list. Again, this is just the top of it, of all of the databases at Family Search, Ancestry, Find My Past, My Heritage, and several others, all in one combined list, so that you can quickly see what's available online in the way of indexes to help you find your records. Now, if you take a look, the very first one, Tennessee Births and Christenings, that's a Family Search, but it's an index only. There are no images with that one. The one down below, Tennessee Delayed Birth Records, that's an Ancestry. It's an index with images. And then there's a $sign because that's a subscription website. Well, the good thing about all of this is if you go to a Family Search Center and you are accessing this list at a Family Search Center, then you get free access to that database at the center, but you have to be at the center using one of their computers to do it. And then it goes on from there. They're divided by type of record and then chronologically. And again, this is only the beginning of the list. It is a very, very long list, but you should be able to find quite a bit in here to help you get started with your Tennessee research or to get you further along. If you take a look on the right side under land records, the very first one, North Carolina and Tennessee early land records, that's where you're going to get an index to those bounty lands right after the Revolution. It is a good place to start if you are looking for people in that era. There's also a reference there to full text search, and I'll show you a little bit of that later. So that's the blue button, the online button. The next one is online research help. And it takes you to this screen and it gives you three options. And the one I want to really talk about is that online genealogy consultations, the one on the left. If you were to select that, it would allow you to schedule a 20-minute free one-on-one Zoom consultation with some expert in the field and with someone who could help you with whatever your question might be. It is a service that Family Search started during the pandemic and they have continued. And this is an exhaustive research possibility for you to get help with the hard problems that'll come up, the brick walls or other type of difficult research questions, this online consultation. The middle group, the Family Search community groups, and the online genealogy research groups are groups that Family Search have organized to help you connect and network with people who are researching in your same area. So there are Facebook groups and such that you can get in there, exchange information, pose questions, get some help from other people who are also just researchers like you, but are willing to help each other. I have found these to be quite useful and quite helpful, so you might want to check those out too. Now, in addition to that top part, and going further down, and in your handout, I've kind of given you a breakdown of most of the types of record links that you can find on this Tennessee page. But to give you a couple of examples, all of these migration routes into Tennessee have a separate wiki article discussing the history of that route and what records might have been created about that route and so on. Worth checking into depending on your time frame and what part of the state they settled in, but you want to check those particular articles out. Middle Tennessee, obviously the Cumberland River. If you were looking at, or the Avery's Trace or Nashville Road, you might want to look at the Great Indian Warpath and so on. There's quite a bit of it there, Nashville Saline River, Natchez Trace, and so on. Each of those is a separate article in the wiki. Also, here's the Wilderness Road. This is just the beginning of it, but you can see it has a historical background, the route that people took, settlers and records and how you find those, internet sites and so on. So this is the background to the Wilderness Road, which was the road that was built down through Western Virginia to the Cumberland Gap. You can also look it up by type of record. So this is Tennessee church records. And again, there's a separate article in the wiki for each of these church denominations. And you can get information about those records and where they could be found, whether or not they're online or if you have to write to an archive or that sort of thing. You can also look up in the wiki the name of a county. So here's Sumner County, Tennessee, and this is the outline for everything that's available on that wiki page, each of those being a link to a separate article. You can also see at the top, there's your key dates of records. So that's for a county. And you can also even go sometimes to a religion or an occupation if you want to do it that way. So the wiki is a lot of material, a lot of information, a lot to go through, but it can give you a lot of ideas of places to go look for information, to find records, or just to even get historical background to solve a problem or to give you a hint as to why a family might have moved where they moved. So taking a look now at historical records, when you're finding historical records on Family Search, you need to kind of follow this process. Most of us want to start with the name, but Family Search is not organized in that way. The first thing you want to do is identify the place the record might have been created. And that could be a town, a parish, a county, a state, or even a country. Think first, where would this record have been created? What was the jurisdiction that created this record? Then once I've identified that, what kind of record do I need and in what time frame to solve my research problem? Am I looking for a baptismal record? Am I looking for a death certificate? Am I looking for a deed? What type of record do I want? And in what time frame would that record have possibly been created? And once I've identified all of that, then I'm ready to go look for a name. So you use that process, and I call it where, what, when, and then who. When you're identifying a database, look first for the place the databases come from, then what kinds of databases cover the record type and time you need, and now you can go look for your people. That's how you work through the historical records. Now, I already showed you that master list of all the databases, so we're not going to look at them right now. The catalog on Family Search also has another way to access what's available. So you go to the catalog under Search Catalog, and it comes up like this, and it defaults that's assuming you're looking for a place. So I'm going to just type in the state. You can put in a county name here as well, but we're going to start with the state. And it comes up with subject headings of material in the Family History Library in Salt Lake, much of which is online, but not all. Excuse me. And then you are going to go through this list and pick a topic, a type of record that might be of interest to you. And then you would open that up and you would get the list. So here is Bible records and church records. So this is a partial list of everything at the Family History Library. Now these are titles. It still does not tell us at this stage if this is something online or not. You would have to open it up and see what it says if it's online or if it isn't. And then if it isn't, you would have to find other ways to locate that particular record. But this is everything at Family Search, and these are church records and Bible records. Give you an example of another type. Cemetery records from Sumner County. You can see all the options here. One of them is on a specific cemetery, Maple Hill, but we also have some transcriptions and so on. Even the Tennessee Historic Records Project, you would have to go through this and go, well, okay, my family were in Maple Hill and I should need to look at this, and so on. Again, you would open it up and then it would tell you if it was online or not. It would have a link. And then here's a newspaper list for Sumner County, mostly Gallatin, but you can see that even all of these newspapers in some format are available online. They may not be complete runs, they might only be a year or so, but at least we know they're there and it is a point of access to look for records. And I'll show you in a little bit one of the ways that works. Another thing on Family Search that a lot of people don't know about or don't use enough is the digital library. Now, under search, it's called books. I wish they would change that to digital library, but it says books. And it pulls up, this is a cooperative project of about 15 or 16 large family history oriented libraries around the United States and Canada. You can see some of them listed on this screen. And what all of these libraries are doing is identifying books in their collection that are in the public domain, that are no longer copyrighted. They are then being digitized, and Family Search serves as the host for all of these digitized books. The last time I saw a number, they were saying it's now over 600,000 volumes. So you go here and choose the advanced search. You can do it just a straight title search if you know it, but you can do by keyword, by title, by subject, or if you have a particular author and you want to see how many books by that author you can access. But we're going to look for one particular book. And the full title was John Blair of Guilford County, North Carolina, and Some of His Descendants, which is a very long title to type. But I didn't have to type the whole title. I just had to put the key words of the title, John Blair, Guilford County. Now, I could have also put that up under keyword, but since that was part of the title, I entered it under title, and I get a list of 162,000 plus hits. The problem with this is I did not put any quotes around any part of it because I was using keywords. So it is searching and going to show me everything that has a John, everything that has a Blair, everything that has Guilford, and everything that had North Carolina. Whether or not all four are together, it's looking for those individual words. But it is going to first show me the books that have all four of those words in their title. So there's my very first one. It's the one I was looking for, John Blair of Guilford County, North Carolina, and Some of His Descendants. And I can click on that and I get a description, a catalog information, and the first page of the book in thumbnail, which in this case happens to be a map. And then it also says view inside. If I click there, I now get the option to go and do an every word search of that book because it's in PDF format, and I can find a name, I can find a farm name, a church name, a creek name, a school name, whatever might be in this book. I can look for all of those words individually. And when I did that, looking for Edgar Blair, there's the Edgar I was looking for, and we find that he is the son of James and then James Jones. This is a resource that is online at Family Search. You can do this at home. You do not have to be at a center or a library. It is free and it gives you access to well over 600,000 volumes now. Many of these are the published county histories of the 19th century and the early 20th. There are church histories, there are school histories, there are family histories. There are even some periodicals that have been digitized by the Allen County Public Library in Fort Wayne, where they have permission to do the digitization of those periodicals. So you may even find some small genealogical society periodicals on here. This is under books, and you will spend a lot of time in this area because this gives us access to the unindexed published works that were out there, and we used to have to kind of by guess and by golly when we were looking at the books on a shelf. And this is not in your handout, but I did want to include full text search. This was introduced at last year's Roots Tech. And why it's important is that on Family Search, only about 30% of all of the images that Family Search has been indexed. The other 70% are not, and we're never going to catch up. It's just impossible. We're digitizing faster than we could have ever indexed. So Family Search developed an AI called Full Text Search. And it is teaching the AI not only to read printed words, but to read handwritten words. So it looks at both, and it will lead you to documents that are unindexed and that you may not even have thought about looking at. So you go to it's a second option under search, full text, and then you get this search screen. You can do keywords, you can do a name, place, and so on. If you notice in the bottom right, it even gives you some hints of how to do a successful search. So I'm going to look for Oliver Foster. I put it in quotes, so it looks for those two words together. I don't want just Oliver's or just Foster's. I want Oliver Foster, and he lived in Sumner County, Tennessee. I can fill in other information if I want, but I want to find everything I can that has Oliver Foster in Sumner County. So I'm going to do the search button, and it comes up with 44 hits or 44 documents, images that have Oliver Foster and Sumner all on the same page. So you see the first one is Sumner County, Tennessee court records, and there's something there with Oliver H. Foster, this day moved the court and so on. It helps me to know that he was a judge, so he's going to be in a lot of these court records. But I'm going to scan down. This is a brief summary of what's on that image. It tells me the years. It's 1797 and 1894 and 1895. Why that big gap, I don't know. But if I come down to the third one, I notice that it has Miss Sally Foster, or it says Miss Same Foster, of Gallatin, daughter of Oliver Foster. Now remember, this is AI, so it isn't perfect in the way it's reading, it's learning, it's being taught, it's getting better, but there is always enough there that you should say, that could be of interest. So I want to see what that says. So I'm clicking on that thumbprint over to the left, and I get this screen. There's the full page of the Nashville American, and hopefully you can see that some yellow squares are distributed throughout that page. And then on the right, the AI attempt at transcribing this newspaper altogether. Well, you could try reading through that, but you have the yellow boxes to go look at. So enlarge it up so you can read it. And by doing so, I found this article on that page. Irby Ellis committing suicide because apparently he was short about $500 in his accounts. And then down at the bottom, it says he's married to Miss Sally Foster. Now, you noticed AI read that as same, but it's clearly Sally, daughter of Oliver Foster, ex-county court judge. What is interesting about this is that I just found this within the last 2 days, and I never knew that Sally had been previously married. She, after this, married a Robert Malone, and that was the marriage that we knew in the family, that we had worked on and traced and everything. We had never known that she had a previous marriage to an Irby Ellis until I found this article. Would I even have thought of going to look for Irby Ellis? No. But because I had full text and it has her father listed in the article, I found it. So that's the power and strength of full text search. All right, moving on to Ancestry, because I do want to cover a lot more in our 20 minutes that are left. So I would just suggest with Family Search, you go in and try all of the options, play around in it, kind of go out on the limb sometimes and say, well, maybe there's something there, and I don't think it's going to be there, and maybe it is, and you might find something that way. Just especially with full text in the books, do a lot of kind of just guessing what you might find there, and you'll be surprised. All right, on Ancestry. Now, taking a look at the Ancestry databases on their own list. Now, remember I said they are also on that compiled list in the wiki, but if you want to see them just on Ancestry, and this is true for every state, you would go to, this is the homepage that you would sign into, and you go up to the word search, and then this seems counterproductive, but choose all collections. You're looking for the databases, all collections. When that opens, it automatically gives you the name screen. Ignore that, scroll down, and at the bottom of the page, there's a map. Defaulting to the United States, but you can see you can change to other continents. You can click on the map or you can click on the word to get to that state's list of databases. So I would click on Tennessee, and here's the beginning of the list. It's divided by type, so we've got census and voter lists, and you notice that there are 10 altogether if you open up the complete list. 25 birth, marriage, and death, 10, and so on in Tennessee. On the right, you can actually go to just a county level. So if I look at Sumner, there are 2 databases specifically for Sumner County. If I were to look at Houston County, there's one for Greene, there's 4 for Hamilton, and so on. So this is the statewide level on the right, left, and you can also narrow it down by county on the right if you want to do it that way. And I would suggest you check out both. So that's how you get to the list of databases at Ancestry. Now, one of the peculiar things about Ancestry is the way they have cataloged their databases. So on this page, if the title of the database has the word Tennessee, it is going to show up. Or in the case of the military, if it has some reference to the military, it's going to show up down there. But it's not going to show you the generic US level church records, for instance. So in your handout, I've given you 2 specific titles of records to go look for. One is the Presbyterian Church records, and the other is Confederate Soldiers records. I chose those 2. The Confederate should be obvious, but the Presbyterian Church, especially in the frontier area of Tennessee, one of the first organized churches is something called the Cumberland Presbyterian. Many of the circuit riding ministers and so forth eventually formed a Cumberland Presbyterian congregation. It had its own newspaper and so forth, and you may find a lot of your early 19th century relatives in those Cumberland Presbyterian records and later Presbyterian churches. Of course, as we come on into the 20th century, you're going to see more diversity in faiths. But early on, you're going to see a lot of Cumberland Presbyterian or Presbyterian people, and you're going to find them in those records. You notice it goes back to 1701. So how do you find those? So in Family Search, in Ancestry, we went to all collections at the top, but now we want to go to card catalog. And then up here in the top left, under the title, type in what I gave you in the handout and be very specific about punctuation and spaces. If you don't, it won't find it. But if you do, then it will take you directly to that database, and then you can do searching in it. And I gave you the complete title so you can look at both of them. Or you can go down under keyword and type in Presbyterian or Methodist or railroads or canals or anything along those lines to see other types of databases that don't get classified under a name of a state. So you need to look in both places to be sure you're not missing a very important database. So here's some examples. This is a U.S. Presbyterian Church record. This is a marriage license out of Sumner County for Thomas Boyers and Sophia Foster, one of Sally's sisters. Found a lot of this sort of information coming into the 20th century. I've even found baptismal records and marriage records and such for people in the 20th century. Note the date with these U.S. Presbyterian Church records. This is for the whole country. It goes to 1970, so you are going to find information of potentially living people in this database as we get closer in time. And as an example, my baptism is in that set of records, as well as my parents' marriage. Here's an example of a Confederate soldier's compiled service record for Oliver Foster, Sally and Sophie's father. And you see this is actually from some kind of an envelope system, a card system that they had. Tells us his various ID numbers. I'm not quite sure why there were so many different numbers. That he was a sergeant and then became a captain. Tells us that he left Gallatin, Tennessee. And if it's kind of interesting to me that the person enlisting him, Thomas Boyers, turned out to be his daughter's father-in-law eventually. Another part of that Confederate pension service thing is this card, which tells us where that he was captured in Greencastle, Indiana in 1864. Then he went to Camp Morton and released on oath June 14th, 1865 by special order. So we get a little bit of the background of him, Captain Company C, 7th Tennessee Regiment. Another sample of what you can find on Ancestry by using that card catalog is the early tax list records, 1783, all the way back to the beginnings of the state. This is what it looks like. There is not a lot of identifiable information, but you do see that the William Gillespie has land on Station Camp, Round Lick, and Harpeth, and those are the number of acres, and then the taxes are going to be over on the right. So another ancestry database, which can be very helpful for those earlier years. The Tennessee State Library and Archives, you have to go there, but they do have material online. And this is their website, and you choose the Search Genealogy Index. That's where you would start. And it takes you to a list of all of their online databases. Now, these are not necessarily going to be images. In fact, for most of them, they are not. They are the index, though, to records being held at the Tennessee Archives. So if you're going to Nashville, it is a way to plan your research trip to the archives. And I'm going to show you a couple of them. The Acts of Tennessee, which date from 1796 to 1850, when an area was first being settled, but did not yet have an organized county courthouse and government and so forth, the only way the citizens had to get divorced, to do all sorts of things, was to petition the state legislature to pass an act to that effect. So in the early years, you wanted a divorce, you had to go to the state legislature and they had to pass an act granting you the divorce. I'm going to show you a very specific one now. So this is what that index looks like for the Cantrell section. And I'm looking for Stephen Cantrell that I knew was part of the family. And I found this one from 1803. The reference is volume 10, page 50. And the description is children legitimized in 1803. Now that seemed rather odd to me, so I wanted to follow up on it. Now remember, this is just an index, but I took a look at everything else on this page that was also 1803, 10, 50, and you see all the name changes. Those are all of his children. Now, I can't get the document here. I had to go to the archives and have it brought out to me. But what this turned out to be was a petition to the state legislature to legitimize all of these children because Stephen has now married their mother. And the document had all of them identified with their birth dates and the name of the mother and the marriage date and the marriage place, all in the same document. But I had to go to the archives to actually get that. But I was led there through this particular index online called the Acts of Tennessee. Then the Confederate pension applications, this is another index online. Now you saw what Ancestry has, but maybe they aren't all on Ancestry. So this would be one way to catch some that haven't made it to Ancestry. There is Oliver H., but there's some other Fosters on there as well. And here's a picture of Oliver H. that I found in a county history at a picnic of Confederate veterans. He sure looks like a judge. And then finally, family Bible records. They have a large collection of these Bible records that have been turned into the National Archives, and then they've digitized them and put them online. This happens to be one where the images are online. All right, taking a quick look, there are some other websites. They are listed in your handout. The Daughters of the American Revolution, there are a lot of people that have applied to the DAR through Tennessee ancestry because of the Revolutionary War, and then those bounty land records particularly. So when you find a patriot, it's called the Patriot Index on the DAR website, this is what you would get. And you notice right at the top, this is for John Williamson. It says right away, future applicants must prove correct service. In other words, this was an application that was accepted, but there are now some questions as to whether or not this is accurate information. And so they are saying if you wish to use John in the future as your DAR ancestor, you would need to reprove it. And I would say any of these application forms or trees that you find online, you must always take the time yourself to prove everything. I'm not saying people deliberately did things wrong, but people get misled. So here's John's. This is what it looks like. It gives his service at the top, and then the lineage of how he gets down to the applicant down below. It is a good reference to get you started, to give you ideas of where to go look for references. This was my first inclination that the Williamsons came out of Virginia, even though they settled in Middle Tennessee amongst all the North Carolinians. Fall 3, Library of Virginia and State Library of North Carolina all have a lot of material online. Fall 3 is a subscription site, but you can get free access at the Family Search Centers, and some libraries now carry it for their patrons. Library of Virginia and State Library of North Carolina are both developing online digital libraries that are growing. In the case of Virginia especially, they're looking at and emphasizing the colonial period and the early part of what would be today the state of Tennessee. So you would certainly want to check those out. Then finally, everything online, but you are going to have to get your feet on the ground locally. So when you're looking at, and this could be thought of as a research idea for no matter where you are, but we're looking at Tennessee. So to definitely think about the county archives. All of the counties have archives now, sometimes in the courthouse, but sometimes in a separate building, more and more in a separate building. And they each have websites that give you hours and what's available and how you contact them and if you need to make appointments and all that sort of thing. I found the Sumner County one very, very helpful, and I was able to actually look at original written documents that they call loose papers there. Or the historical and genealogical societies. Almost all the big towns in Tennessee have that, as well as the three main ones for the state. They all have collections, sometimes that are online, sometimes in a local place, sometimes in both. But again, you would want to check out their website, see what they have, and then make arrangements for your research trip. And then the local libraries, they could be a major size public library, or it could even be a local genealogical library, such as this one in Wilson County in the lower right, where the Genealogical Society has its own library in a storefront with volunteers and all to help you for that area. And then don't forget your cemeteries. Go out, walk them, but go to the office, see if they've got records in the office that might give you everybody in a plot or who bought it and who sold it and whatever. This is George Foster's in Gallatin. This is Oliver Foster's father. So you want to be sure you cover your cemeteries as well. There's a lot of material online, find a grave, billion graves and so forth, but they are nowhere near complete. The only complete thing to do is to actually visit a cemetery, go to the office, get the records, and walk the rows yourself. For one thing, you can read the signs sometimes better, the tombstones better than somebody who's trying to take it from a picture, for instance. You can read the top part, but what's all that writing at the bottom about George that you would want to be able to read up close? So cemeteries would be your big one. So now let's take a look at the bibliography. Now I gave you a rather extensive bibliography of some of the key books that I have found for Tennessee research, but I'm going to talk about two. One is called The Founding of the Cumberland Settlements. This would be Middle Tennessee, starting with those bounty landholders from North Carolina. This book was published in 2009. That's the second edition, I think. And it's very extensive. It has beautiful artwork. You can see the artwork on the cover. But what it is really great for, other than the history of the founding of those settlements, is that it has a CD with the complete map of all of those bounty land grants, who got them and where it was. So you can actually take a look at exactly where your ancestor's grant was if he received a grant from North Carolina for his service. In addition to this volume one, there were two additional volumes that carried it further into history, but all three of them have CDs mapping the deeds and the grants that were given to people in particularly Middle Tennessee. There is some from Eastern in the later volumes. Allen County has it online, has it available. Most of the libraries I have found do not. It is, last I checked, it was available used on Amazon for over $300. But if you ever go to Allen County, this would definitely be a book to check out. And then these are the two additional ones. The second atlas of the Cumberland Settlements, and then the Cumberland and Duck River, which goes in a little bit later. All of these are at Allen County. Then the other book I wanted to talk about in the bibliography is Albion Seed by David Fisher. Now, this is a very thick book, but very, very readable. And what Mr. Fisher did was he identified 23 social and cultural mores. And then he examined the four main settlement groups that settled the American colonies and compared the way they handled those 23 mores of culture and society. And then he compared them. So there's one section on the Pilgrims, there's one section on the Cavaliers of Virginia, there's one section on the Quakers, but as the fourth major section is the Scots Irish. And there is such historical background of where they came from in Ireland, why they came, why they settled where they did, and then coming down the Virginia valleys and into Kentucky and Tennessee, how they brought their culture with them. It is a fascinating book to give you a very, very broad but deep understanding of the folk ways of Tennessee and why people did what they did, of our ancestors. And even thinking today, it's where country music comes from, it's where folk dancing comes from. You'll see a lot of similarities to a lot of things that we do down in the South, particularly from this one section of Albion Seed. And I cannot recommend it enough. And a lot of libraries do now have this book. And so, happy hunting, everybody. And we're just about out of time, but I don't know. Megan, can we take some time for questions?
There is one question in the chat we have time for. Hannah asked, was the I'm not sure how to pronounce that. Was the Watauga settlement part of the Loyal Land Company grant, or was the grant farther west?
As I understand it, excuse me, as I understand it, was further west. Watauga was kind of an independent up there in the corner of North Carolina, Virginia, and Tennessee. People that had settled very early on and were trying to establish their own government. They were not an organized land grant effort. So they would have been separate and a little bit west, as I understand it.
All right, thank you so much. And there were a few people in the chat who just thanked you for some of the things you talked about. So thanks for this great webinar. And thank you all for joining us today. We hope that you will join us for our next webinar on March 18th with Catherine Grant about learning to love family history research. A recording of this webinar will be made available by next week. You can view that on our YouTube channel or on our website. If you have any comments or questions, you can always email us at fh_webinars@byu.edu or follow us on Facebook. Thank you and have a wonderful week.